Hello and welcome to History at Night. For centuries, we have been taught that the ultimate untamed frontier was a vast western wilderness waiting to be conquered. But the most terrifying boundary of the ancient world was actually a narrow stretch of dark water known as the Pillars of Hercules. This was a forbidding threshold, where all safe maps ended and absolute oblivion began. Tonight, we will sail past this forbidden edge to uncover a chilling tale of fabricated sea monsters, ruthless ancient capitalism, and fearless navigators. For centuries, the Mediterranean Sea was the ultimate comfort zone for the ancient world, functioning as a vibrant, enclosed highway of highly predictable trade. Greek galleys and Egyptian barges navigated its azure waters with a sense of absolute security, relying on familiar constellations and gentle seasonal winds to guide their profitable journeys. This inland ocean was a thoroughly mapped and fully understood marketplace, where great empires exchanged grain, gold, and philosophical ideas under the watchful eyes of their benevolent gods. The shores were dotted with prosperous coastal cities that grew incredibly wealthy by moving goods from one sunny harbour to another within this sheltered aquatic sandbox. The wealthy maritime merchants enjoyed a remarkably stable environment where calculated investments almost always yielded highly predictable returns. Everything made sense in this brightly lit world where the rules of commerce and navigation were clearly established and universally respected by every seasoned mariner. But if you sailed far enough to the western edge of this sunlit utopia, the comforting azure waters violently collided with something fundamentally incomprehensible. Looming menacingly at the edge of the known world stood the legendary Pillars of Hercules, a towering geographic bottleneck that marked the absolute boundary of human sanity and survival. Beyond these colossal stone sentinels lay the great ocean river, a churning expanse of freezing black water and suffocating fog that ancient cartographers simply labelled as the realm of monsters. Society collectively agreed that venturing past this point was not merely foolish navigation, but a guaranteed suicide mission into an apocalyptic abyss where the ocean itself allegedly boiled. Every rational sailor knew that this was the absolute end of the map, a terrifying threshold where the comforting laws of physics abruptly ceased to exist. Here is where the story takes a fascinating turn away from the paralysed masses and focuses on a radically different kind of mindset. Deep within the bustling commercial heart of Carthage, a 30-year-old merchant named Margot stood silently in a dimly lit study, obsessively staring at a piece of parchment. Unlike the cautious traders of his generation, who were perfectly content collecting profits from safe Mediterranean routes, Margot possessed the aggressive, high-stakes psychology of a modern venture capitalist. He looked at the abrupt edge of the map, where the ink abruptly stopped at the Pillars of Hercules, and he did not see a terrifying graveyard of doomed ships. Instead, he saw the ultimate market inefficiency, a colossal blank space that represented an unprecedented opportunity to secure a devastating monopoly over the most valuable resources on Earth. For a man driven by the relentless pursuit of exponential growth, the terrifying stories of boiling seas and abyssal monsters were merely psychological barriers, keeping his competitors comfortably trapped. Margot understood the fundamental principle that extraordinary wealth is never generated in crowded, saturated markets where everyone plays by the exact same rules. He was fully prepared to leverage his entire family fortune, risking generations of accumulated Carthaginian wealth, to finance an expedition into the absolute unknown. This was a calculated gamble of staggering proportions, the ancient equivalent of betting a massive corporate empire on a disruptive, highly experimental technology that everyone else deemed entirely impossible. He methodically calculated the catastrophic risks of losing everything to the monstrous waves of the Atlantic, weighing them against the unfathomable rewards of finding untapped sources of precious metals. Mathematical equation in his mind was ruthlessly clear, because he knew that whoever successfully navigated the apocalypse would essentially own the lucrative future of global commerce. He recognized that the ultimate prize was not merely discovering a new trading partner, but establishing a ruthless corporate monopoly over the raw materials that fueled the military-industrial complex. To execute this audacious vision, Margot needed more than just overflowing chests of silver. He needed a vessel and a crew capable of defying the deeply ingrained psychological terror. He began assembling a clandestine operation in the shadow of the great Carthaginian shipyards, purposefully seeking out men who possessed exceptional maritime skill and desperate ambition. while the rest of the civilized world slept comfortably under the protective umbrella of familiar myths. Mago was essentially building a maritime startup designed to disrupt the ancient geopolitical order. The towering stone gates at the edge of the world were no longer a warning sign, but rather an exclusive doorway, waiting to be violently kicked open by this merchant. What happened next will surprise you, as this small band of aggressive risk-takers prepared to sail their fragile ships directly into the gaping jaws of an angry ocean. They were willingly stepping into a void that was widely believed to be the graveyard of the gods, fully prepared to wager their mortal lives for an unparalleled financial return. To execute a vision of this unprecedented magnitude, Margot knew that conventional maritime technology would be entirely useless, requiring a fundamentally different approach to naval engineering. He established a highly classified shipyard hidden away from the bustling commercial ports, essentially create an ancient black site for rapid technological prototyping. This clandestine operation was completely shielded from the prying eyes of rival spies, operating under strict codes of absolute secrecy, where a leaked blueprint meant instant execution. Every piece of timber brought into this secluded facility was carefully vetted, ensuring only the finest materials were utilized for a project that defied all conventional wisdom. The atmosphere inside these hidden docks crackled with the intense energy of an aerospace laboratory attempting to build a vehicle capable of leaving the atmosphere. The standard trading galleys utilized by the civilized world were perfectly adequate for navigating the calm, highly predictable bathtub of the Mediterranean Sea. These typical vessels were essentially rigid boxes held together by basic joinery and thick ropes, designed strictly for short coastal hops, where the water rarely became violent. If a merchant attempted to sail one of these conventional ships past the Atlantic threshold, the vessel would rapidly succumb to the devastating kinetic energy of the deep ocean. The crushing swells and chaotic currents of the unknown sea would literally shatter a standard Greek hull into thousands of pieces of useless driftwood within hours. Margot understood that sending a standard ship into that chaotic void was essentially an elaborate method of committing mass suicide. This terrifying reality necessitated the deployment of a closely guarded industrial secret that would give the Carthaginians an overwhelming asymmetric advantage over every other maritime power. The brilliant shipwrights employed by Margot utilized a highly sophisticated interlocking technique known as mortise and tenon construction to completely revolutionize the structural integrity of the vessel. Instead of merely tying wooden planks together, they meticulously carved precise slots into the edges of the heavy cedar boards and locked them together with corresponding wooden pegs. Thousands of these tight joints were hammered into place, locking the massive timbers into a seamless, incredibly resilient shell that was virtually impenetrable. This engineering process created a revolutionary piece of hardware that fundamentally changed the limitations of human travel across open water. The true genius of this specific construction method was not merely its watertight nature, but its astonishing ability to remain structurally flexible under extreme environmental stress. When a massive Atlantic wave crashed against this advanced Phoenician vessel, the thousands of interlocking wooden joints would actually absorb and distribute the catastrophic kinetic energy. Instead of rigidly fighting against the overwhelming force of the ocean and breaking, the entire hull would slightly twist and bend, moving harmoniously with the brutal rhythm of the water. It functioned more like a living organism than a static wooden object, allowing the crew to ride over mountainous swells that would destroy any other ship. This superior technology was their ultimate insurance policy. Designed specifically to conquer an environment everyone else believed was unsurvivable, as the final layer of protective pitch was painted onto the resilient hull under the cover of a moonless night. The atmosphere among the chosen crew grew incredibly tense. They began loading the specialized vessel with heavy provisions and survival gear, completely stripping away unnecessary luxury items to maximize their operational efficiency. Every man standing on those secluded docks fully understood that this remarkable feat of engineering was the only physical barrier standing between them and the crushing abyss. They were about to intentionally sail off the edge of the known map, placing their absolute faith in the meticulously carved wooden joints, holding their fragile world together. But here is where it gets interesting, as their theoretical preparation was finally forced to confront the violent reality. The fateful morning of the departure offered no grand ceremonies or cheering crowds to mask the crushing gravity of their unprecedented undertaking. The heavily modified vessel silently slipped away from the familiar coastal waters under the cover of darkness. It permanently left behind the comforting warmth of the Mediterranean sun that had reliably nurtured their ancestors for countless generations. And as they relentlessly pushed westward toward the absolute edge of the known map, the very atmosphere around them began to undergo a sinister, almost palpable transformation. The gentle and highly predictable trade winds that had always reliably filled their sails were abruptly replaced by a biting, erratic chill that seemed to seep directly into their marrow. Ahead of them, emerging from the hazy horizon like jagged teeth violently tearing through the sky, stood the towering monolithic cliffs known universally as the legendary Pillars of Hercules. Navigating through this narrow geographic bottleneck felt absolutely nothing like exploring a new commercial trade route. It felt infinitely more like willingly sailing directly into the gaping maw of an ancient cosmic predator. The exact instant the bow of the ship pierced the invisible threshold separating the familiar inland sea from the vast outer ocean, the physical reality of their world fractured completely. The welcoming, crystal clear azure waters that had fundamentally defined their entire maritime existence instantly vanished. They were violently replaced by a churning, suffocating expanse of impenetrable black liquid that aggressively swallowed the ambient light. This was not the benevolent sea they understood, but a hostile, fiercely alien environment characterized by towering, unnatural swells. These dark mountains of water moved with a heavy predatory momentum across the endless, fog-covered horizon. The sheer kinetic force of these massive, rolling waves slamming mercilessly against the wooden hull sounded exactly like the deafening roar of a subterranean beast attempting to shatter their fragile sanctuary. For the hand-picked crew of highly seasoned sailors, this sudden environmental shock immediately triggered a wave of paralyzing psychological terror. They had successfully spent their entire lives mastering the relatively calm, predictable Mediterranean currents. They were exceptionally hard men, thoroughly accustomed to the brutal physical realities of ancient maritime labour. Yet absolutely nothing in their extensive professional experience had prepared them for this profound level of overwhelming sensory deprivation. The comforting, now familiar coastline that had always served as their ultimate navigational anchor was rapidly swallowed by a thick, suffocating grey fog. This terrifying mist rapidly descended upon the freezing water exactly like a heavy, inescapable burial shroud. They were abruptly stripped of all their reliable visual references, completely blinded by a dense dampness that aggressively obscured the life-saving warmth of the sun. The primal, deeply ingrained human fear of the absolute unknown began to fiercely grip the minds of the terrified men as they stared helplessly into the swirling, featureless void. Every sudden drop down the steep, unforgiving face of a massive Atlantic swell sent a sickening jolt of pure adrenaline, coursing relentlessly through the collective veins of the terrified crew. They tightly gripped the freezing ropes with bleeding, white-knuckled hands. They were desperately peering into the blinding fog, while silently waiting for the legendary sea monsters to finally emerge from the abyssal depths. The deeply rooted, horrifying, mythological warnings they had internalized since early childhood were no longer just frightening tavern stories. They were now an imminent, terrifying reality physically manifesting in the chaotic darkness immediately surrounding their incredibly fragile wooden vessel. Frantic, whispered prayers to a pantheon of ancient deities were violently snatched away by the howling wind. This sensory assault left the desperate men feeling entirely abandoned by the heavens in a cursed, desolate realm. It genuinely felt as though they had sailed completely off the physical edge of the flat earth. They believed they were now endlessly free, falling through the freezing, chaotic purgatory of a watery mythological underworld. The agonizing, relentless psychological pressure of this absolute geographic isolation threatened to entirely break the rigid discipline of the crew. This internal collapse was dangerously imminent, long before they had even fully reached the primary open ocean currents. Desperate whispers of violent mutiny began to circulate rapidly in the damp air. The sheer magnitude of their vulnerable isolation threatened to entirely overpower the established, strict chain of command. They were completely suspended in a profoundly hostile fluid nightmare, acutely aware that reversing course against the violent Atlantic tides was now an absolute physical impossibility. They were trapped permanently in this terrifying, uncharted frontier without any viable escape route. The invisible crushing weight of the suffocating fog and the relentless booming rhythm of the violent black water seemed carefully designed to systematically shatter their fragile mortal sanity. But what happened next will surprise you, as the paralyzing grip of this mythological terror was about to be abruptly challenged by a profoundly different kind of raw human resilience. As mythological terror threatened to completely shatter the fragile minds of the crew, a profound sense fell over the violently pitching deck. The younger sailors had entirely abandoned their vital posts, dropping helplessly to their bruised knees on the slippery, salt-encrusted wooden planks. They were desperately crying out to an incredibly long list of protective deities, pleading for miraculous divine intervention to save them from the churning black abyss. In their terrified minds, the only logical response to this overwhelming existential threat was absolute surrender to the unpredictable will of the ancient gods. However, the chaotic ocean demands physical competence rather than spiritual devotion when a massive wall of freezing water is actively attempting to crush your vessel. This critical moment of collective paralysis desperately required a completely different kind of salvation, one forged in gritty human resilience rather than abstract mythological hope. Stepping aggressively into this chaotic void was Hiram, the 45-year-old master helmsman, who possessed a deeply weathered face, carved by decades of relentless oceanic exposure. He perfectly embodied the ultimate blue-collar worker of the ancient maritime world. He was a remarkably tough man who trusted the thick calluses on his hands infinitely more than the invisible whims of distant deities. Hiram did not waste a single precious second dropping to his knees to whisper desperate prayers into the howling, freezing wind. Instead, he violently kicked a paralyzed sailor away from the main rigging and instantly began barking a series of rapid, highly technical commands. He understood fundamentally that survival in this brutal, unforgiving environment was strictly a matter of applied physics, precise mechanical leverage, and relentless physical labour. Was there any room for paralysing superstition when thousands of pounds of hostile water were preparing to violently smash their fragile wooden hull? No, because Hiram immediately threw his entire muscular weight against the massive wooden steering oar, aggressively fighting the kinetic energy of the churning Atlantic Ocean. He expertly angled the plunging bow of the modified vessel directly into the steepest part of the towering black wave, avoiding a devastating broadside strike. The terrified crew watched in absolute awe as the groaning ship violently shuddered under the immense pressure, yet somehow miraculously climbed the steep face of the terrifying liquid mountain. Through sheer brute force and unparalleled technical mastery, Hiram forcefully commanded the chaotic elements to yield to his intensely focused human will. He systematically dragged the terrified young sailors back to their crucial stations, physically forcing them to focus on the immediate mechanical tasks of adjusting the heavy linen sails. This incredibly intense burst of focused, practical labour instantly broke the suffocating spell of mythological terror, replacing their paralysing panic with the highly structured rhythm of survival. As the exhausted crew finally stabilised the battered vessel, the thick and suffocating fog briefly parted overhead to reveal a single point of brilliant light shining in the absolute darkness. While the younger men instinctively looked downward in pure terror, Hiram calmly looked upward to confidently locate the famous Phoenician star for cold, hard navigational data. Now listen carefully, because this specific shift in human perspective represents one of the most profoundly important evolutionary leaps in the entire history of ancient exploration. Hiram firmly demonstrated to every single terrified man on that pitching deck that human ingenuity and relentless hard work could successfully conquer the darkest frontiers. He proved conclusively that they did not need to patiently wait for a miraculous rescue from the indifferent heavens when they possessed the practical tools to forge ahead. Their ultimate salvation was entirely in their own capable hands, driven entirely by the uncompromising spirit of a man who simply refused to surrender to the legendary dark. As the vessel stabilized under Hiram's absolute control, the terrified crew remained frozen in agonizing anticipation. They had been aggressively conditioned since childhood to believe that crossing this invisible threshold would immediately trigger a violent, apocalyptic event. According to revered scholars and terrifying tavern tales, back in the civilized Mediterranean, the ocean beyond the Pillars was supposed to be a literal boiling cauldron. They fully expected the suffocating grey sky to collapse upon their fragile wooden masts, crushing them under the immense weight of the angry heavens. Every sudden crack of the hull and gust of freezing wind was interpreted as the triumphant arrival of a legendary Leviathan. Yet the anticipated cosmic execution completely failed to materialize in the churning waters. The terrified sailors remained clinging to the freezing rigging, frantically scanning the dense fog for supernatural horrors that simply refused to appear. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the impenetrable wall of suffocating grey mist that had aggressively swallowed their vessel began to thin out and disperse into the frigid air. The violent, chaotic swells that had initially threatened to completely destroy them gradually settled into a massive but surprisingly predictable oceanic rhythm. Instead of dropping off the terrifying edge of a flat earth, the exhausted crew suddenly noticed a rugged coastline silently emerging through the dissipating fog to their right. They were steadily sailing northward along the dramatic, deeply scarred western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, flanked by towering cliffs that looked nothing like the gates of hell. The brutal, biting cold of the North Atlantic wind aggressively whipped across the wooden deck, definitively proving that the terrifying legends of a violently boiling sea were entirely fabricated. There was absolutely no supernatural fire heating this dark water, only the relentless reality of an untamed oceanic frontier. This monumental realization fundamentally shattered the terrifying psychological prison that had held the entire ancient Mediterranean world completely captive for centuries. The so-called Sea of Total Darkness was definitively not a supernatural void designed by angry deities to violently punish human arrogance. It was simply a remarkably cold body of water, governed entirely by the unforgiving but highly predictable natural laws of wind, tide, and atmospheric pressure. As they navigated further along the rugged European coastline, the men began to observe the raw, majestic beauty of this wildly untamed environment. The towering ocean swells were certainly dangerous and required absolute mechanical precision to navigate, but they were not actively malevolent entities seeking their destruction. The universe was completely indifferent to their bold intrusion, which was paradoxically infinitely more comforting than being actively hunted by vindictive sea gods. Their pragmatic survival abruptly transformed the terrifying abyss into a manageable physical workspace. The final layer of the mythological fog was completely eradicated when the crew dared to look directly down into the freezing black depths. They had spent their entire lives fully expecting to see the glowing, malevolent eyes of giant sea serpents violently rising from the abyssal darkness to consume them. Instead, the freezing water eventually revealed massive, glittering schools of ordinary fish moving in perfect synchronization beneath the heavy wooden hull. Occasionally, the sudden explosive breach of a massive whale would startle the crew, but they quickly recognized it as a magnificent biological creature rather than a demonic world-ending monster. These marine animals completely ignored the heavily modified Phoenician vessel, peacefully continuing their ancient migration patterns through the incredibly vast, nutrient-rich Atlantic currents. The terrifying mythological beasts that had successfully haunted the collective nightmares of the greatest ancient empires were abruptly reduced to mere biological wildlife. This profound moment of clarity completely redefined their entire understanding of the physical world, stripping away the terrifying magic to reveal cold reality. They had successfully sailed directly into the gaping maw of the legendary underworld and miraculously found absolutely nothing but freezing wind, dark water, and ordinary marine biology. The highly anticipated cosmic retribution was nothing more than a phantom menace, a meticulously constructed illusion that had finally completely evaporated in the freezing Atlantic air. But as Margot stood silently on the pitching deck, watching the exhausted crew slowly realise their newfound safety, a much darker, far more cynical reality quietly emerged. If the crushing supernatural dangers of the Atlantic Ocean were entirely fabricated, a deeply unsettling question naturally began to haunt the shadows of this monumental discovery. If there are no world-ending monsters, no violently boiling seas, and no collapsing skies, then why did those terrifying legends exist in the first place? As the massive Phoenician vessel pushed relentlessly northward through the freezing, churning currents of the untamed Atlantic, the suffocating fog eventually parted to reveal their ultimate, highly classified destination. Emerging from the endless grey horizon was not a mystical realm of ancient gods or a terrifying abyssal drop. Instead, it was a rugged, violently windswept archipelago that modern geography recognises as the British Isles. The imposing chalk cliffs and densely forested coastlines were completely shrouded in a thick, chilling mist that seemed to swallow the crashing waves. This massive wall of fog created an atmosphere of intense, heavy isolation for the terrified crew. For Margot and his exhausted men, this desolate, waterlogged landmass at the very edge of the earth represented something infinitely more valuable than mythological glory. They had intentionally sailed into this freezing void for a single, deeply pragmatic purpose that drove the entire ancient global economy. Buried deep within the muddy, unforgiving soil of this primitive island was an abundant supply of tin. This incredibly rare and absolutely vital metallic ingredient was entirely required to forge superior bronze weaponry. In a world completely dominated by brutal military conquests, bronze was simply the ultimate technological currency. Whoever ultimately controlled the incredibly valuable tin supply effectively controlled the delicate balance of global power. Margot immediately ordered Hiram to carefully navigate the heavily loaded ship into a shallow, protected cove. Here, the violent, crashing Atlantic swells finally gave way to a remarkably calm, exceptionally grey shoreline. The heavily armed Phoenician sailors quietly dropped their heavy stone anchors, securing the wooden vessel in the shallow water while scanning the dense tree line. Now listen carefully, because what happened next on this remote, freezing beach completely defies our conventional understanding of ancient human interaction. They did not march onto the shore with drawn swords to violently conquer the native population or enthusiastically wave their arms to establish diplomatic relations. Instead, Margot and his highly disciplined men immediately initiated a profoundly bizarre and highly orchestrated economic ritual. They silently unloaded their incredibly valuable cargo, carefully arranging brilliantly dyed purple garments directly onto the wet sand. Alongside the expensive textiles, they meticulously placed gleaming glass beads and carefully measured weights of pure gold. Once the luxurious Mediterranean goods were perfectly displayed, the entire crew immediately retreated back to their wooden ships. They deliberately left the magnificent ancient treasure completely unguarded on the hostile, incredibly wet foreign beach. This was the legendary silent trade, a meticulously calculated economic strategy designed for monumental business deals. It allowed them to flawlessly execute massive transactions without ever speaking a single potentially dangerous syllable. Slowly, the heavily tattooed local tribesmen emerged from the dark, damp forest to thoroughly inspect the alien artifacts. They cautiously evaluated the gleaming foreign wealth in total silence, carefully calculating its immense material worth. Eventually, they placed heavy, meticulously mined blocks of raw tin right next to the beautiful Carthaginian goods. Following the unspoken rules, the natives then retreated back into the dense, protective cover of the surrounding trees. From the absolute safety of the pitching deck, Mago would carefully evaluate the newly offered exchange rate. He was aggressively calculating the brutal profit margins of this incredibly primitive, highly lucrative international market. If the provided amount of raw tin was deemed perfectly sufficient for his incredibly expensive purple textiles, his men would quickly return to the sandy beach. They would rapidly collect the valuable metal and peacefully sail away into the thick, freezing fog. However, if the local offer was insultingly low, they would completely ignore the heavy tin blocks. They would patiently wait on their anchored ships for the cautious natives to emerge again and significantly increase their bid. This brilliant, completely speechless negotiation perfectly bypassed the dangerous risks of sudden, extremely violent cultural escalations. For centuries, the classical world was paralyzed by a collection of terrifying bedtime stories masquerading as geographical facts. Whenever a Greek philosopher or a Roman senator looked westward toward the Pillars of Hercules, they did not see a horizon of opportunity. They saw a nightmarish abyss, where the ocean boiled like a cauldron and gargantuan sea serpents waited to drag entire armadas down into the suffocating grey depths. This supreme mastery of storytelling was the invisible wall that kept the Mediterranean firmly contained. The horrifying accounts of the Atlantic were accepted as undeniable truths by the greatest minds of antiquity. Every sailor who dared to approach the boundary was warned of the catastrophic fate waiting in the form of the legendary kraken or the sudden plunging waterfall at the edge of the flat earth. But here is where the historical record takes a turn that feels shockingly modern and deeply sinister. As Mago and his crew silently traded their goods on the frigid shores of Britannia, Yet they were completely unbothered by any mythical leviathans or supernatural vortexes. The horrifying monsters of the deep, the impenetrable walls of poisonous fog, and the catastrophic boiling waters were not natural phenomena. They were a carefully engineered campaign of ancient disinformation. This was not a primitive misunderstanding of a mysterious ocean, but rather a deliberate and highly sophisticated strategy of psychological warfare. The terrifying legends that haunted the dreams of the classical world were entirely fabricated by the Carthaginians themselves. Margot and the wealthy merchant elites of Carthage understood a fundamental truth that would resonate perfectly with modern corporate titans. If you have discovered an incredibly lucrative and entirely untapped market, the most efficient way to protect it is not by building a massive defensive fleet that drains your capital. The ultimate defense mechanism is to weaponize the fear of the unknown. 9. These ancient venture capitalists realized that human psychology was far more malleable and powerful than any wooden blockade. By manufacturing a terrifying narrative about the Atlantic, they erected an invisible barrier that cost them absolutely nothing to maintain. The Carthaginian Senate actively funded and encouraged the spread of these horrific tales across every known port to ensure their absolute, uncontested dominance over the highly lucrative tin and purple dye trade routes. This ancient strategy is essentially the blueprint for modern market manipulation and ruthless corporate monopolies. Now, just like a massive contemporary hedge fund spreading strategic rumours to crash a competitor's stock, the Carthaginians were engaging in high-stakes anti-competitive behaviour. They effectively created the world's first large-scale fake news campaign to establish an airtight monopoly over the most valuable commodities of the era. The Greeks and Romans, despite their formidable military might, were completely outmaneuvered by this brilliant application of corporate deception. Carthage functioned exactly like a modern megacorporation, utilising aggressive disinformation and extreme market control to keep their political and economic rivals hopelessly paralysed in fear. How could any Roman general justify funding a naval expedition into an ocean universally believed to be the domain of inevitable death? The execution of this ancient public relations campaign was remarkably brilliant in its simplicity. When Carthaginian sailors returned to the bustling cosmopolitan ports of the Mediterranean, they were given specific instructions by men like Margot. They would sit in the crowded taverns of Sicily or Egypt, loudly spinning horrific tales of their narrow escapes from demonic sea creatures and apocalyptic whirlpools. These rugged sailors served as the perfect undercover lobbyists for the Carthaginian monopoly. Their fabricated trauma provided the undeniable eyewitness testimony needed to validate the terrifying rumours. The more gruesome the stories became, the more the intellectual elite of rival empires accepted them as scientific geographical facts. The Carthaginians were essentially paying their own employees to act as crisis actors in a grand theatrical production designed solely to terrify and manipulate the competition. This monumental deception reveals the true genius of the Phoenician descendants. They did not conquer the Western world with bronze swords, massive siege engines, or overwhelming infantry formations. They conquered it by successfully hijacking the collective imagination of their enemies. While the rest of the civilized world cowered in fear behind the safety of the Pillars of Hercules, Mago and his fellow merchants were quietly amassing a staggering fortune that would make modern venture capitalists appear impoverished. The dreaded edge of the world was never a physical boundary, but rather an artificial construct built entirely out of weaponized whispers and strategic lies. It was a masterpiece of corporate espionage that kept the greatest empires of antiquity permanently locked inside their own terrified minds. When we look back at the monumental achievements of the ancient world, we have a profound tendency to heavily romanticize the daring individuals who first ventured into the terrifying unknown. We naturally want to picture these bold early navigators as noble, selfless pioneers. We see them much like the legendary Greek philosophers, driven by an insatiable curiosity to map the uncharted stars. Our modern historical consciousness, deeply influenced by idealized tales of heroic exploration, prefers to believe that crossing the Atlantic was a pure triumph of the human spirit. We imagine these ancient sailors standing bravely on the crashing bows of their fragile wooden ships. We want to believe they were staring into the dark horizon with a noble desire to conquer ignorance and claim eternal glory. Narrative. We love to construct a comforting narrative where the pursuit of knowledge naturally triumphs over the primal fear of the mythological abyss. But here is where it gets incredibly interesting, perhaps a bit cynical, for those who prefer the poetic version of history. The harsh reality of this epic maritime expansion is that Margot and his hardened Carthaginian crews were not sailing into the freezing, violent Atlantic abyss to write elegant philosophical treatises. They were certainly not trying to secure a legendary place in the historical archives. They were operating with the cold, fiercely calculating mindset of ruthless modern Wall Street executives. These merchants viewed the terrifying ocean simply as a high-stakes corporate investment vehicle. Their unprecedented journey into the geographical void was not fueled by a thirst for academic knowledge, but rather by the raw, unapologetic engine of ancient capitalism. They genuinely did not care about proving whether the earth was round or flat, as long as the shipping lanes remained overwhelmingly profitable. The ultimate prize that actually pushed these practical men to willingly risk their lives in a universally feared ocean was not human enlightenment. Instead, it was the aggressive acquisition of two highly specific and immensely lucrative physical commodities. They were desperately hunting for the cold, rain-swept shores of Britannia to extract massive quantities of tin. This metal was an absolute elemental necessity for forging the high-grade bronze weapons that continuously fueled the endless military campaigns across the Mediterranean basin. Furthermore, they were harvesting millions of putrid, decaying Murex Sea snails from the coastal waters to painstakingly extract the ultra-rare Tyrian purple dye. This deeply vibrant pearl pigment was effectively the most expensive and tightly controlled luxury asset of the ancient global economy. It was a supreme status symbol so profoundly coveted that wealthy elites and powerful royalty would gladly bankrupt their entire estates just to acquire it. It's a somewhat bitter and deeply sobering historical realization to accept that the most spectacular geographical leaps of the ancient era were not actually inspired by a noble quest for collective human progress. Instead, it was the insatiable hunger for exclusive wealth and the relentless pursuit of an airtight corporate monopoly that truly forced mankind to violently break past its established physical limits. The romanticized glory of geographical discovery, the very thing we passionately celebrate in our modern textbooks, was merely a convenient byproduct of a hyper-capitalistic ancient machine. The harsh truth is that the map of the known world was not expanded by dreamers seeking spiritual enlightenment. It was ruthlessly expanded by aggressive Carthaginian merchants, relentlessly chasing unprecedented, astronomical profit margins. These venture capitalists of antiquity were entirely willing to gamble their ships, their inherited fortunes, and the fragile lives of their working-class sailors. They sailed into the darkest corners of the natural world entirely because the projected return on investment was simply too massive for any highly ambitious businessman to ignore. To truly comprehend the sheer magnitude of this ancient monopoly, we must understand the paralyzing paranoia that constantly shadowed these Carthaginian voyages. Maintaining a geographical secret of this monumental scale required far more than just spreading terrifying rumors in foreign taverns. Margot and his fellow merchants knew perfectly well that human greed would eventually compel someone to call their bluff. They lived in perpetual anxiety that a highly ambitious Roman captain, perhaps desperate for political glory or driven by sheer curiosity, might silently slip out of a Mediterranean port and attempt to follow their exact wake. The threat of corporate espionage was a terrifying daily reality that haunted every single mile of their journey along the Iberian coast. If the Romans ever managed to track them to the misty shores of Britannia and discovered the true source of the precious tin, their exclusive market dominance would evaporate overnight. This devastating possibility forced the merchant elites to establish a set of operational protocols that were shockingly extreme. Now listen carefully, because this is where the story shifts from a clever business strategy into something profoundly dark and ruthless. The Carthaginian Senate did not merely suggest that their captains protect the trade routes. They demanded absolute secrecy with a terrifyingly absolute mandate. This was the ancient equivalent of a blood-sealed non-disclosure agreement enforced not by corporate lawyers, but by a standing order of mass suicide. When Mago stood on the violently pitching deck of his cargo ship, staring into the impenetrable Atlantic fog alongside his veteran navigator Hiram, they both fully understood the grim reality of their contract. They were not just sailing against the devastating forces of nature, they were sailing with a loaded gun pointed directly at their own heads, fully prepared to pull the trigger the moment their monopoly was genuinely threatened by an external competitor. Imagine the sheer cinematic tension of this horrifying scenario playing out on the freezing open ocean. A dense bank of fog begins to temporarily clear, and Hiram, with his weather-beaten eyes scanning the horizon, suddenly spots the unmistakable silhouette of a Roman military galley trailing several miles behind them. The Romans have successfully bypassed the mythological terrors and are quietly shadowing the Carthaginian vessel, desperately hoping to map the secret path to the Tin Islands. Panic would naturally ripple through the working-class crew as they realised a heavily armed warship was hunting them. But Margot, representing the ultimate cutthroat executive, would not order his men to prepare their weapons for a desperate defence. He would not command Hiram to catch the wind and attempt a risky evasion manoeuvre into the deeper ocean. Instead, he would issue a chillingly calm directive that defies every basic human instinct for survival. Without a single moment of hesitation, Margot would order Hiram to deliberately steer their incredibly valuable wooden ship directly toward the most treacherous, jagged coastal reefs they could find. The mandate was absolute and non-negotiable. They were instructed to intentionally crash their vessel, shattering its wooden hull against the unforgiving rocks, ensuring that it sank instantly into the freezing, turbulent depths. Every piece of navigational equipment, every detailed maritime chart, and every single crew member was expected to be swallowed by the ocean. The Carthaginians preferred total annihilation over the slightest possibility of a Roman captain rescuing their maps or capturing a navigator to interrogate. They were entirely willing to sacrifice a massive capital investment and condemn dozens of highly skilled labourers to a horrific death, solely to guarantee that the intellectual property of the trade route remained completely secure. This shocking level of extreme individualism and ruthless corporate calculation is almost difficult to fully process today. Margot was actively weaponizing his own death and the deaths of his employees to protect a profit margin. But why would a seasoned, practical working-class man like Hiram ever agree to execute such a blatantly suicidal maneuver? Because the Carthaginians had effectively invented the world's first comprehensive corporate life insurance policy. Before Hiram even stepped onto the gangplank in his home port, he was given an ironclad guarantee from the merchant elites. If he drove the ship into the rocks to protect the monopoly, his grieving family back in North Africa would be handsomely compensated for generations. His fatal sacrifice was treated as the ultimate premium paid to secure a lavish financial future for his children. It was a brutally transactional arrangement where human lives were meticulously calculated as acceptable collateral damage on a corporate ledger. This chilling dynamic reveals the true, terrifying core of the Carthaginian expansion. These men were navigating the deadliest, most unpredictable waters on the face of the earth, battling monstrous waves and blinding storms, all while carrying a standing order to murder themselves at a moment's notice. The Romans may have possessed the greatest organised military machine of the classical world, capable of conquering entire continents with sheer disciplined force, but they were fundamentally outmatched by this unprecedented level of fanatical devotion to extreme wealth. A soldier fighting for political glory will eventually retreat when the odds become suicidal, but a Carthaginian crew, completely financially incentivized and perfectly willing to drown themselves to protect a trade secret, represents a terrifyingly modern kind of dedication. This absolute willingness to embrace destruction for the sake of market dominance was the bloody foundation upon which an entire empire was silently built. The terrifying extremes of their operational protocols and their massive disinformation campaigns ultimately yielded an economic harvest that completely reshaped the ancient world. While traditional powers like Rome and Sparta were continuously exhausting their national treasuries by maintaining massive standing armies and fighting brutal territorial wars, Carthage took a fundamentally different path to absolute supremacy. They realized that true global dominance did not require conquering endless tracts of land or subjugating millions of hostile citizens through sheer military force. Instead, they built an unprecedented financial leviathan by simply monopolizing the supply chain of the most valuable resources in existence. The staggering wealth flowing back through the Straits of Gibraltar transformed this North African coastal city into the undisputed economic crown jewel of the entire Mediterranean basin. Their society became a shining testament to the unimaginable prosperity that could be achieved by successfully monetizing the absolute edge of the known geographical world. The physical manifestation of this exclusive maritime network was absolutely breathtaking to any foreign merchant or diplomat who sailed into their heavily guarded harbour. Because they exclusively controlled the vital flow of essential metals and luxury goods from the forbidden Atlantic, the Carthaginians were able to construct a sprawling metropolis that rivaled the wildest architectural dreams of antiquity. They financed the construction of massive six-story apartment complexes to house their booming population of traders, craftsmen, and bold navigators. They engineered the legendary Kothon, a brilliant circular naval harbour that served as both a highly efficient commercial hub and an impenetrable fortress for their secret fleet. Their markets overflowed with an endless abundance of foreign exotic goods, towering mountains of precious silver, and agricultural surpluses that effectively shielded their citizens from the famines ravaging other empires. This spectacular urban development was not funded by violently plundering neighbouring cities, but rather by silently executing the most lucrative logistical monopoly in human history. But the real secret to their unprecedented global dominance was not just the physical cargo ships or the hidden maps. The true foundation of the Carthaginian Empire was an incredibly aggressive, highly resilient entrepreneurial culture that feels remarkably similar to the modern startup ecosystems of America. Unlike the rigid aristocratic societies of Europe, where political power was strictly determined by ancient bloodlines and land ownership, Carthage operated as a ruthless, hyper-competitive corporate meritocracy. They actively rewarded extreme risk-takers and visionary merchants who were willing to gamble everything on a terrifying voyage into the absolute unknown. This was a society that fundamentally understood that the highest financial yields always reside directly on the other side of the greatest potential catastrophes. Their elite citizens were essentially ancient venture capitalists who successfully institutionalized the concept of high-risk innovation, transforming the terrifying wilderness of the unforgiving ocean into an endlessly flowing river of capital. By mastering the psychological manipulation of their aggressive rivals and fully embracing the deadly, unpredictable realities of deep-sea navigation, Carthage achieved a staggering level of economic leverage that no traditional standing army could ever possibly match. They effectively placed a massive, invisible tax on the entire civilized world by acting as the sole gatekeepers to the Atlantic resources. Every time a Greek hoplite raised a bronze shield or a Roman senator draped a purple cloth over his shoulders, they were unknowingly enriching the very merchants they despised. The Carthaginians proved definitively to the entire world that whoever firmly controls the flow of rare information and extreme international logistics ultimately controls the inevitable destiny of empires. They built a spectacular global superpower, not with the brutal thrust of a bloodied spear, but with the quiet, calculated courage to sail boldly into the absolute terrifying darkness. For generations, in Ohkid, the wealthy elite of this North African metropolis lived under the intoxicating illusion that their absolute market dominance would last for an eternity. They had successfully convinced themselves that overwhelming financial leverage and brilliant psychological warfare were the ultimate unbeatable weapons of global supremacy. Their deeply entrenched corporate hubris unfortunately blinded them to a brutal, unforgiving reality of the ancient world. You can flawlessly manipulate the global economy, construct the most elaborate disinformation campaigns in history, and ruthlessly monopolize every precious resource available. But all of those highly sophisticated tactics become utterly useless when a heavily armed rival decides to simply flip the geopolitical game board. The fatal flaw in their grand capitalistic design was the arrogant assumption that their fierce competitors would always agree to play by the established, civilized rules of commerce. Across the Mediterranean waters, a completely different kind of terrifying superpower was rapidly gathering an unstoppable, aggressive momentum. The Roman Republic was absolutely not interested in playing a complex game of corporate espionage or carefully balancing international trade deficits with their neighbours. They were a fiercely militaristic society, driven by an insatiable appetite for sheer, unadulterated territorial conquest and absolute political domination. While the Carthaginian venture capitalists were busy calculating their quarterly profit margins, Roman legions were systematically marching across the Italian peninsula. They were forging a terrifying, highly disciplined war machine fundamentally fueled by blood and iron. The wealthy merchants of Carthage foolishly believed their towering mountains of silver could permanently buy them immunity from this rapidly approaching military storm. Yeah. They arrogantly assumed they could simply hire massive mercenary armies to defend their vast assets, treating a catastrophic war as just another operational expense. Yeah. But what happened next completely shattered their comfortable reality and brought their magnificent economic empire to a devastating abrupt end. When the Roman war machine finally turned its predatory gaze toward North Africa, the resulting conflict did not resemble a hostile corporate takeover. It was a merciless, apocalyptic military annihilation that forcefully erased centuries of brilliant maritime innovation in a matter of days. The legendary Kothon, the seemingly impenetrable circular naval harbour that had protected their secret commercial fleet for generations, was violently breached and swallowed by raging fire. The towering apartment complexes, once echoing with the voices of highly ambitious navigators, crumbled into suffocating grey ash under the relentless bombardment of Roman siege engines. The wealthiest city of the ancient world was systematically dismantled stone by bloody stone, leaving nothing but a desolate wasteland where a spectacularly thriving metropolis once proudly stood. Here is where the historical narrative becomes deeply tragic and incredibly profound for anyone studying the collapse of great empires. As the hardened Roman soldiers ruthlessly looted the smouldering ruins of the Carthaginian capital, they eventually breached the most heavily guarded underground archives of the fallen merchant elite. What these conquering legionnaires violently dragged out into the harsh Mediterranean sunlight was not just heavy chests overflowing with gold. They had successfully unearthed the absolute most closely guarded intellectual property of antiquity. The secret navigational charts detailing the exact hidden currents of the Atlantic Ocean and the classified locations of the lucrative Tin Islands were finally exposed. In a single chaotic afternoon, the terrifying legendary sea monsters, the apocalyptic boiling abysses, and the impenetrable walls of fog were instantly reduced to nothing more than faded ink stains on stolen parchment. The heavy velvet curtain of their magnificent maritime deception had finally fallen, completely exposing the brilliant machinery of their massive fake news campaign to their greatest enemies. The unyielding military might of Rome had forcefully ripped away the terrifying mythological boundaries that had successfully paralysed classical civilization for centuries. The vast, heavily feared Atlantic Ocean was no longer a nightmarish realm of inevitable death, but another conquered territory waiting to be exploited by pragmatic Roman governors. The chillingly brilliant psychological strategies of the Carthaginian elite were entirely swallowed by the relentless, marching gears of Roman history. While the physical city of Carthage was completely erased from the map, the true lingering tragedy lies in the sudden evaporation of their beautifully constructed illusion. They had built the greatest economic empire of the ancient world out of pure weaponized shadows and carefully planted whispers, only to watch it inevitably shatter under the crushing weight of cold Roman steel. Empires rise and fall, but the relentless urge to push past comfortable boundaries remains woven into the very fabric of human ambition. Stepping beyond known frontiers has always required confronting the chilling void that lies just past the horizon. Those ancient mariners proved that true progress demands stepping away from safety to chase the unknown. Perhaps that is their final enduring legacy across the corridors of time. They remind us that history is never a finished chapter, but an ongoing journey of rediscovery. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. The physical empire of Carthage was violently erased, but their deeply ingrained pioneer spirit fundamentally altered the trajectory of human history. Whether they were driven by an insatiable thirst for unprecedented wealth or a genuine desire to conquer the terrifying unknown, those ancient sailors fundamentally redefined the physical limits of our world. They boldly demonstrated that the most terrifying boundaries are often just elaborate psychological constructs waiting to be shattered by sheer audacity. That same relentless American drive to constantly push past the comfortable, established frontiers still beats fiercely in the heart of every modern explorer. The dark, freezing waters of the Atlantic were never a permanent barrier, but rather a terrifying challenge waiting for someone brave enough to call the bluff. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.